Late August in eastern Tennessee always carried a certain quiet finality. The heat lingered. Cicadas still buzzed in the trees, but everyone knew summer was ending. School schedules were already taped to refrigerators. Football practice had started. Parents were shifting back into routines. For teenagers, it was the last stretch of freedom before time closed in again. In Claiborne County, that feeling hung heavy the weekend Ethan Parker, Lucas Reed, and Hannah Collins decided to go camping. Ethan was 17, tall for his age, with a calm, steady way of moving through the world. He had grown up hunting deer with his father and knew the ridges and hollows of the local forest better than most adults. Lucas was 16, smaller, louder, restless, in a way that made teachers nervous and friends laugh. He followed Ethan everywhere, partly because Ethan had a car, partly because Ethan seemed unshakable. Hannah, also 16, balanced them out. She was careful, thoughtful, and practical, the kind of person who packed extra batteries and reminded everyone to bring water. She had known Ethan since middle school. Lucas had met both of them through mutual friends. By the end of that summer, the three of them had become inseparable. The plan was simple. One night in the woods, nothing extreme. No alcohol, no big bonfire, no trouble. Just a tent, a small cooler, some cheap food, and a quiet place to sit before life sped up again. They chose a ridge a few miles outside town, a place locals used for hiking and hunting. It wasn't remote by Tennessee standards, but it felt wild enough. There was an old coal mine somewhere deeper in the woods, sealed decades earlier after a series of collapses. Adults mentioned it in passing sometimes, usually as a warning when kids wandered too far. The teens had heard the stories. None of them took them seriously. On Saturday morning, August 24, 2002, the mood was light. Ethan borrowed his father's pickup, promising to be back by Sunday afternoon. Lucas showed up late, carrying a backpack that looked half empty and a fishing rod he probably wouldn't use. Hannah arrived last, her bag neatly packed, hair pulled back, already reminding them about the weather forecast. Neighbors saw them loading gear into the truck. Parents waved. Someone joked about bears, even though there hadn't been a serious sighting in years. Nothing about the moment suggested it would be remembered. They left town just before noon, tires humming against the two-lane road that led toward the forest. Cell service faded quickly out there, which wasn't unusual. Hannah mentioned it once, more as an observation than a concern. Ethan nodded, confident they wouldn't need their phones anyway. They turned onto a gravel road, then another, until the trees closed in and the sound of the engine echoed off the hillsides. They parked near a trailhead that locals used, but rarely monitored. From there, they hiked less than a mile uphill, carrying the tent between them. The spot they chose was flat, dry, and close enough to a creek to be convenient without risking flooding. The mine entrance, wherever it was, stayed out of sight. If it crossed their minds at all, it didn't matter. That afternoon passed the way dozens of other summer days had. They set up the tent, collected firewood, and joked about how crooked the stakes were. Ethan cooked hot dogs over a small fire. Lucas skipped rocks across the creek. Hannah took pictures on a disposable camera she'd bought specifically for the trip. There was nothing reckless about their behavior. They didn't wander far. They didn't split up. They stayed where anyone familiar with the area would expect them to stay. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped just enough to feel comfortable. The woods grew quiet in the way forests do at dusk, not silent, but subdued. Later, a hunter passing through the area would tell police he saw 3 teenagers near the ridge that evening, laughing, carrying water jugs, heading back toward a campsite. He didn't think much of it at the time. He would think about it constantly later. Night fell without incident. The fire burned down to embers. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Inside the tent, the 3 of them talked about school, about jobs, about how fast everything felt like it was moving. It was the kind of conversation people forget until it becomes the last one they ever have. Sometime after midnight, the forest settled into stillness. Sunday morning came and went without anyone in town noticing their absence. That wasn't unusual. They'd said they'd be back sometime that afternoon. Parents assumed they were sleeping in or packing slowly. Ethan's father spent the morning fixing a fence. Hannah's mother ran errands, planning to ask about the trip when her daughter got home. Lucas's family expected him late. He was always late. By Sunday evening, the assumptions began to shift. The sun dipped below the hills. Dinner passed. Phones rang without answers. At first, there were excuses. Poor service. Dead batteries. One more hour. Then another. By the time darkness returned, worry had replaced patience. Ethan's father drove the route toward the ridge just after 9 that night. He expected to see the truck pulling out or parked near the road. He didn't. The gravel lot was empty. No headlights appeared from the trees. The air felt heavier than it had that morning. He told himself they had chosen a different spot. He told himself kids lost track of time. Hannah's mother called friends. No one had heard from her. Lucas's parents checked his room, then his friends' houses. Nothing. By midnight, the calls between families had taken on a different tone. They weren't asking casual questions anymore. They were comparing timelines. Who last saw them? What exactly they had packed? Where exactly they had planned to go? The idea that something could be wrong crept in slowly, like fog. No one said it out loud at first. Saying it would make it real. By Monday morning, August 26th, the fear could no longer be contained. School buses rolled through town. The forest sat quiet. The pickup truck was still missing. The parents met at the sheriff's office, voices low, hands shaking. Officers listened carefully, writing down names, ages, clothing descriptions. The report went from late return to missing teenagers in a matter of minutes. Deputies drove back toward the ridge. This time, they found the truck parked exactly where it should have been. Locked, undamaged, no note, no sign of a struggle. The sight of it, sitting alone among the trees, drained the room of every remaining hopeful thought. They followed the trail the teens would have taken. Within half an hour, they reached the campsite. The tent was still there, partially collapsed from dew and time. Backpacks lay inside. Food sat untouched. Shoes were neatly lined near the entrance. It looked like the teenagers had stepped away briefly, expecting to return. There were no footprints leading off in a clear direction, no broken branches, no blood. The forest offered nothing but stillness. An officer radioed for backup. Another stood quietly, staring at the tent, trying to imagine 3 kids leaving everything behind without a word. Someone mentioned the mine, almost as an afterthought. It had been sealed. It wasn't close. It wasn't relevant. But the longer they stood there, the harder it became to explain the emptiness. 3 teenagers don't vanish from a campsite without a reason. And as the morning wore on, and search teams began to assemble at the edge of the woods, one uncomfortable truth settled over everyone involved. Whatever had happened to Ethan, Lucas, and Hannah hadn't announced itself loudly. It hadn't left obvious damage. It had taken them quietly, somewhere just beyond where anyone had thought to look. By the time the missing persons report was officially logged, the forest had already begun doing what it always did best. It absorbed sound. It erased movement. It closed itself off. Claiborne County deputies returned to the ridge just after sunrise on Monday, with a different posture than the night before. This wasn't a worried parent's search anymore. This was procedure. Radios crackled. Names were spoken into logbooks. Times were recorded. The moment was marked, because that's what law enforcement does when uncertainty crosses into something more dangerous. The truck was documented first, photographed, its position noted. The gas gauge showed it had been driven directly there, no detours. The keys were missing, which suggested the teens had taken them, not abandoned the vehicle. There were no dents, no broken glass, no signs anyone else had been near it. It sat where Ethan had parked it, patient and useless. From there, deputies followed the trail again, this time with intent. The campsite confirmed what they already feared. The tent hadn't been torn or dragged. It hadn't collapsed violently. It had simply sagged, the way tents do when they've been left alone too long. Inside were sleeping bags, clothes, flashlights, snacks. Backpacks leaned against the tent wall, heavy with gear that should have been essential if the teens had gone anywhere for more than a few minutes. Food sat untouched near the fire pit, wrappers still folded, a cooler lid half open, no animal disturbance, no spilled supplies, no reason to believe they'd packed up and moved on. Search and rescue was called in by mid-morning. Volunteers from nearby towns arrived with maps and boots, some of them knowing the teens by name. The forest was divided into grids, a methodical approach designed to eliminate guesswork. Each team was assigned a section, each movement logged, each discovery radioed back, even if that discovery was nothing at all. Dogs were brought in before noon. Experienced canine handlers walked the perimeter of the campsite, letting the animals circle, sniff, focus. One dog locked onto a scent quickly, pulling hard toward the east. For a brief moment, hope surged. The handler followed, boots crunching over leaves and loose rock. The scent trail lasted less than 100 yards. Near a rock outcropping, the dog slowed, then stopped. It circled once, confused. The handler encouraged it forward. The dog sat down instead, the universal sign that the trail had ended. Not faded, not weakened, ended. Handlers later explained that scents don't just vanish. They disperse gradually. They twist. They grow faint. For a trail to stop, that abruptly meant something had interrupted it. Weather could do that, but the forecast had been clear. Wind could scatter it, but the trees were dense. Water could erase it, but there was no stream nearby. The rock outcropping became a focal point. Teams searched the area repeatedly, moving stones, checking crevices, scanning the ground for any sign that 3 teenagers had passed through. Nothing appeared. No footprints, no dropped items. The forest floor looked untouched. By early afternoon, additional volunteers arrived. Fire departments brought all-terrain vehicles to cover more ground. Helicopters were requested, but cloud cover delayed their deployment. Radios filled the air with numbers and coordinates, each transmission carrying the same underlying message. We found nothing. The search expanded outward in widening circles. Creek beds were checked in case someone had slipped. Steep slopes were examined for signs of a fall. Hunters walked paths only locals knew. Every hour that passed without a discovery drained the optimism from the teams on the ground. Inside the mobile command post, deputies quietly compared timelines. When exactly had the teens last been seen? How long would it take them to reach certain points? Whether they might have decided to explore somewhere else? These conversations weren't arguments, but they weren't agreements either. Everyone was working with the same facts, and none of them added up. The abandoned mine entered the discussion slowly. It had been sealed decades earlier, after a series of collapses made it unsafe. Official records were thin. The entrance was supposed to be filled and reinforced. The area wasn't marked clearly on newer maps, partly because the land had changed hands multiple times, partly because no one expected anyone to go near it anymore. A small team was sent to locate the general area. They found evidence of old infrastructure, rusted metal, a depression in the earth that suggested something had once been there. But the ground was unstable, and the shafts were believed to be collapsed deep inside. Without specialized equipment, and with no immediate indication the teens had gone that way, command ruled it non-essential. It wasn't dismissed completely. It was postponed. That decision would echo later. By nightfall on Monday, the search paused. Not because there was nothing left to do, but because darkness made everything more dangerous. Parents gathered at the edge of the woods, watching teams return with tired faces and empty hands. No one had to say it out loud. If the teens were injured, if they were lost, time mattered. Tuesday began before dawn. Helicopters finally flew overhead, scanning clearings and ridgelines. Search dogs were redeployed with new scent items taken from the teens' belongings. Again, the trails led nowhere. Creek beds gave up nothing. Trails remained empty. The forest refused to speak. The absence of evidence began to feel oppressive. In most searches, something turns up. A shoe, a scrap of clothing, a broken branch that shouldn't be broken. Here, there was nothing. It was as if the teenagers had stepped out of the campsite and dissolved into the trees. Investigators noted what wasn't there as carefully as what was. No signs of a struggle suggested they hadn't been forced away. No packed gear suggested they hadn't planned to leave. No calls or messages suggested panic. Whatever happened had occurred quickly, quietly, and without warning. By Wednesday, the operation had shifted. Hope still existed, but it was thinner now, stretched by exhaustion and unanswered questions. The forest had been searched thoroughly in every logical direction. Each new grid yielded the same result. Families began to hear phrases they dreaded. Statistically, unlikely. At this point, no one said the words out loud, but everyone felt them pressing in. On Thursday afternoon, one of the dogs again showed interest near the rock outcropping. Handlers watched closely, wondering if something had been missed. The dog circled, sniffed, then lost focus. Another dead end. By the end of the week, officials faced a reality they couldn't escape. They had searched where the teens should have been. They had searched where logic said they might go, and they had found nothing. The case was still active. The search wasn't over, but something had changed. The confidence that effort alone would produce answers was gone. As equipment was packed away each evening and radios were powered down, a quiet question lingered among the teams. If 3 teenagers could vanish this completely from a place so thoroughly searched, then maybe the problem wasn't where they were looking. Maybe it was where they hadn't. By the time September settled over Claiborne County, the search had thinned from organized lines of volunteers into something quieter and more desperate. Official efforts continued on paper, but the daily presence of uniforms in the woods faded. What replaced them was uncertainty, and uncertainty has a way of inviting stories. At first, people spoke carefully. They said things like, maybe the kids had decided to leave on their own. Maybe they had gotten turned around and wandered farther than anyone expected. Teenagers did impulsive things. People reminded each other. Teenagers ran away sometimes. It wasn't said with conviction, more like a fragile attempt to keep hope alive. But for the families, those suggestions landed like accusations. Running away didn't explain the backpacks left behind. It didn't explain the locked truck. It didn't explain silence. As the weeks passed, the tone shifted. Whispers replaced optimism. Someone mentioned bears, even though wildlife officials confirmed there was no evidence of an animal attack. Someone else talked about coyotes, about mountain lions that officially didn't exist in the area. Hunters shared stories of strange sounds in the woods at night. None of it came with proof. It was just noise filling the space where answers should have been. The mine came up again, more frequently now. Locals debated whether it was really sealed, whether kids could have found a way in. Older residents remembered accidents from decades earlier. Men trapped underground, bodies never recovered. Others dismissed it as folklore, a convenient place to put fear when logic failed. Law enforcement didn't reopen the site. Without evidence tying the teens to it, there was nothing new to justify the risk. Another theory emerged quietly, then spread. A transient had been spotted near the ridge around the time of the disappearance. Someone claimed to have seen a man camping illegally deeper in the woods. A description circulated that never quite matched anyone real. Deputies followed up, checking shelters, questioning people passing through. Nothing held. No one confessed. No physical evidence connected a stranger to the campsite. Media attention lingered through the fall, then drifted away. A few local segments aired. A short newspaper article ran on the 1-month mark, then the 3-month mark. By winter, the story was no longer breaking news. It became something mentioned in passing, something people remembered when driving past the turnoff to the ridge. For the families, time didn't soften anything. It sharpened it. Ethan's father replayed that Saturday, mourning over and over, wondering if he should have insisted on going with them, or at least checked the gear more carefully. He returned to the woods every weekend, walking trails already walked 100 times, convinced there had to be something everyone else missed. Hannah's mother kept her room exactly the same, backpack hook still empty, calendar still turned to August. Lucas's parents argued quietly about details that no longer mattered. Who had dropped him off, what time he'd left, whether he'd packed enough food. Grief didn't move in a straight line. Some days were numb, others were full of anger. At times, the families leaned on each other. At other times, tension crept in. Different theories implied different kinds of blame. If the kids ran away, why hadn't anyone noticed signs beforehand? If they fell into danger, why had no one stopped them from going? Private searches began almost immediately after the official ones scaled back. Friends, relatives, and volunteers returned to the forest with maps and flashlights, combing the same ground again and again. They searched because doing nothing felt worse. Each trip ended the same way, with tired legs and empty hands. In the spring of 2003, a fisherman found a single shoe lodged against rocks miles downstream from the ridge. For a brief moment, the case surged back into the spotlight. Deputies collected it carefully, hopeful and cautious all at once. It was the first physical item discovered outside the campsite since the disappearance. Testing confirmed it didn't belong to any of the teens. The disappointment was crushing. What should have been a break in the case became another reminder of how little was known. The river gave up nothing else. Neither did the forest. Investigators revisited every angle, quietly, methodically. Credit card activity was checked. Phone records were reviewed again. Dental records were prepared, just in case. There was no evidence of foul play, but also no evidence of survival. The case hovered in an unbearable middle ground. By late 2003, conversations about the teens took on a different tone. Past tense crept in. People lowered their voices when speaking to the families. Holidays passed with empty chairs. Birthdays came and went without celebration. Hope didn't vanish completely, but it thinned into something fragile and exhausting. The mine remained untouched. It was still considered unstable. Entering it without a clear reason was a liability no one wanted to accept. On paper, it stayed listed as sealed and inaccessible. In reality, no one could say for certain what condition it was in anymore. In early 2004, after nearly 18 months with no credible leads, authorities made a decision that felt procedural to them and devastating to the families. The case was reclassified. Missing, presumed deceased. It didn't mean the investigation was closed. It meant resources were redirected. It meant searches would no longer be active. It meant the burden of waiting shifted almost entirely onto those left behind. For some, the classification brought a grim sense of clarity. For others, it felt like abandonment. The forest hadn't given up the teens, and now, officially, no one was actively asking it to. As years passed, the story settled into local memory. New families moved into town who didn't know the names. Teenagers who had been children in 2002 grew up hearing the story secondhand. as a cautionary tale without an ending. The ridge remained open. The mine remained sealed. Life went on unevenly. But beneath all of it, one question never went away. How could 3 people vanish so completely, leaving behind everything they needed to survive in a place that had been searched over and over again? For some, the answer had to be something hidden, something buried, something no one had been willing or able to look at closely. And somewhere beneath the trees, beneath the rock and the soil, the mine waited, unchanged by time, holding whatever truth had been left behind. As the years passed, the forest did what time and neglect always allow it to do. It erased boundaries. It softened edges. It made places that once felt important feel forgotten. By 2005, the ridge where Ethan Parker, Lucas Reed, and Hannah Collins had vanished looked no different than any other stretch of woodland in Claiborne County. Trails grew faint. Brush thickened. Fallen leaves buried footprints that no one was looking for anymore. The campsite itself disappeared under seasons of rain and rot, until even people who had searched there dozens of times struggled to find the exact spot again. Officially, the case still existed. It lived in filing cabinets and digital archives, reduced to incident numbers and summary notes. Occasionally, a deputy would review it when a tip came in, usually vague and unprovable. A sighting in another state. A rumor passed through a bar. A dream someone felt compelled to report. Each one was logged, evaluated, and dismissed. Unofficially, the disappearance settled into something quieter and more dangerous. It became a story. Locals spoke about it carefully, usually late at night, usually when the woods were close and the fire was low. Teenagers whispered about the ridge as a place you didn't go alone. Parents used it as a warning without naming names. The details blurred over time, but one element stayed constant: the mine. No one talked about it directly. It was always implied. An old shaft. A bad place. Somewhere you didn't want to stumble into. Over time, the mine took on a strange dual identity. To some, it was nothing more than a rumor, an exaggerated piece of Appalachian history. To others, it was the only explanation that had ever made sense. On paper, the mine barely existed anymore. County records showed it had been sealed decades earlier, after being deemed structurally unsound. Maps were updated. Boundaries were redrawn. When land parcels changed hands, references to the mine quietly disappeared. Not out of conspiracy, but convenience. If something wasn't in use, if it posed a risk, it was easier to forget it than to maintain it. Maintenance required money. Oversight required accountability. And accountability meant responsibility if something went wrong. By 2006, the area around the mine had become dense with growth. Trees leaned where warning signs once stood. Ground that had been compacted by heavy equipment loosened. Small sinkholes formed and filled with leaves. Anyone walking through the forest without knowing exactly what to look for would see nothing unusual at all. That same year, an anonymous call came into the sheriff's office. The man on the other end identified himself only as a former miner. He said he had worked in the area decades earlier and remembered ventilation shafts that were never fully sealed. He claimed that while the main entrance had been filled, secondary shafts had been left unstable, hidden by terrain and brush. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't claim knowledge of what happened to the teens. He simply said the mine was not as closed as officials believed. The tip was logged. At the time, the department was understaffed and stretched thin. There was no new evidence tying the teens to the mine. Entering it would require specialized equipment, safety protocols, and approvals that no one was eager to pursue. The risk was real. Collapses were common in old mines. Liability was unavoidable. The call was noted. The file was updated. No follow-up occurred. Years slipped by quietly after that. Families marked anniversaries alone. They visited the ridge less frequently, not because they didn't care anymore, but because returning without answers reopened wounds that never healed properly. Some clung to hope in private. Others tried to build a life around the absence, carrying it like a weight that never lightened. Law enforcement shifted focus as personnel changed. Younger deputies knew the case only as a reference. Older ones remembered the search, the confusion, the frustration. No one remembered why the mine hadn't been investigated more thoroughly. It simply hadn't been. From the outside, it looked like negligence. From the inside, it was something quieter and more human. Fear of making the wrong decision. Fear of triggering an accident. Fear of uncovering something no one was prepared to handle. The forest continued to reclaim the ridge. Seasons passed. Winters froze the ground. Springs loosened it again. Subtle changes occurred beneath the surface, unseen and undocumented. Soil shifted. Old supports weakened. Ventilation paths collapsed or opened, depending on the weather. The mine did not stay frozen in time. It aged. By the late 2000s, it had been effectively erased from public awareness. New maps omitted it entirely. Hiking guides didn't mention it. Park literature focused on scenic overlooks and wildlife. The ridge was presented as safe, familiar, ordinary. But for those who remembered the disappearance, the absence of answers grew heavier with time. The theories that once competed for attention faded, leaving only the ones that had never been disproven. The teens hadn't run away. There had been no evidence of violence, no signs of animals, no credible sightings. What remained was a gap, a physical one, somewhere near where the scent trail had ended, somewhere no one had wanted to look too closely. In hindsight, the warning signs were subtle but consistent. Reports of ground instability, minor sinkholes filled in without documentation. Unexplained drafts felt near certain rock formations, details that meant nothing on their own, but together suggested that something beneath the forest was changing. Still, no action was taken. The case lived on in a strange limbo, not active, not closed, not forgotten, but not pursued. It was safer that way. Safer to let time dull the edges than to reopen a question that might demand an answer no one wanted to hear. By the time 6 years had passed, most people believed the truth would never come out. The forest had kept its secret long enough that it felt permanent. Whatever had happened to Ethan, Lucas, and Hannah was assumed to be unrecoverable, lost to time and terrain. But the land doesn't forget everything. Sometimes it shifts just enough to expose what was buried. And when that happens, it doesn't do it on a schedule anyone expects. It waits for the wrong step, the wrong season, or the wrong person, doing an ordinary job, to notice something that shouldn't be there at all. By October of 2008, the ridge had become just another line on a map for most people. The disappearance of Ethan Parker, Lucas Reed, and Hannah Collins had slipped into the background of county memory, resurfacing only on anniversaries or in quiet conversations that ended with a shake of the head. The forest no longer felt tense to outsiders. It felt ordinary again. That illusion was part of why no one noticed when the land itself began to change. That fall had been unusually wet. Heavy rains worked their way into the soil, loosening ground that had been compacted for decades. Small sinkholes began appearing along less traveled sections of the park, shallow at first, then deeper. Visitors reported uneven footing near the ridge, nothing dramatic, just enough to warrant a closer look. The reports landed on the desk of State Park Ranger Daniel Crow, a man who had spent most of his adult life walking terrain exactly like this. Crow was methodical by nature. He trusted maps, but he trusted his own eyes more. On a cool morning in mid-October, he set out alone to inspect the boundary area near the ridge, carrying standard gear and a clipboard with maintenance notes. He wasn't thinking about the missing teens, not consciously. To him, the ridge was a problem of erosion and liability, not history. As he moved off the established trail, he noticed subtle changes almost immediately. The ground felt softer in places it shouldn't have. Leaves settled differently, as if something beneath them had shifted. These weren't dramatic signs, but Crow had learned long ago that the forest rarely announced its dangers loudly. Near a dense patch of undergrowth, he stopped. The soil dipped slightly, just enough to catch his attention. There was no record of instability in that exact location. He pushed aside branches and vines, exposing dark earth and rock beneath. What he saw didn't look natural. The depression was too uniform, too deliberate. Crow knelt and cleared more debris. Beneath years of accumulated growth was the outline of a circular opening, partially collapsed, its edges reinforced with rotting timbers and rusted metal. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakable. This wasn't a sinkhole, it was a shaft. There were no warning signs, no fencing, no documentation marking its presence. According to official records, nothing like this should have existed. Crow felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the instinctive response of someone who knows they've found something they weren't supposed to. He radioed in his location and reported a possible undocumented structure. Protocol dictated he secure the area and wait. But curiosity, mixed with unease, pulled him closer. He leaned toward the opening carefully, aware of the risk. A faint draft moved upward, carrying a smell that didn't belong in open forest. It was metallic, stale, old. Crow turned on his flashlight and angled it downward. The beam cut through darkness and caught on uneven rock walls, then disappeared deeper. He scanned slowly, heart rate steady but elevated. And then he saw it. Something pale, wedged against the stone. At first, his mind refused to categorize it. It didn't move. It didn't reflect light the way rock did. It was out of place in a way that was immediately unsettling. Crow froze, the weight of the moment pressing in as recognition crept closer. He pulled back sharply. Against protocol, he had looked, and he knew enough now to stop. Backup arrived within the hour. Crow briefed supervisors carefully, choosing words that emphasized uncertainty but couldn't hide urgency. The area was cordoned off. Specialists were contacted. Old mining records were requested, though few were expected to exist. By afternoon, the tone had shifted from maintenance to investigation. Word traveled faster than officials intended. By evening, whispers reached town. A mine shaft. Something found. People who hadn't spoken about the case in years felt the past rush back all at once. The next morning, a controlled entry was authorized. Mining safety experts assessed the opening first, testing air quality, shoring up weak points. The shaft wasn't a main entrance. It was a ventilation passage, partially collapsed, but still accessible. Exactly the kind of structure the anonymous caller had warned about years earlier. As teams prepared to descend, the weight of 6 years settled over everyone involved. This wasn't just a technical operation anymore. It was a reckoning. The descent was slow and deliberate. Every step was measured. The air grew colder and heavier as they moved deeper, headlamps cutting narrow paths through darkness. The walls bore marks of old tools, scars left behind by labor long forgotten. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. Not far in, they found evidence of disturbance. Broken supports. Fresh collapses layered over older ones. It suggested movement over time, not a single event. As they progressed, the smell intensified, unmistakable now. The pale shape Crow had glimpsed came into full view. It was human bone. The operation stopped immediately. The shaft was secured, and law enforcement took over. Forensic teams arrived with equipment and documentation materials, treating the site with the care it demanded. The mine, long ignored, was now the center of the investigation it had quietly waited for. As the teams worked deeper, the scale of what had been missed became clear. This wasn't a simple fall into an open hole. This was a network, partially collapsed, partially intact, hidden beneath years of assumption and avoidance. Remains were located close together, positioned in a way that suggested desperation rather than chance. Personal items followed. Fabric remnants, a rusted flashlight, objects that had once been carried into the woods with no expectation of never returning. Identification would take time, but no one needed to say the names out loud. Everyone there understood. By late afternoon, the families were notified. The calls were careful, restrained, heavy with words chosen to minimize harm that couldn't be minimized. Answers were coming, finally, but they came at a cost no one had ever wanted to pay. As night fell over the ridge, lights burned steadily near the shaft. The forest, which had kept its silence for so long, was giving up its secret piece by piece. What had been dismissed as non-essential, too dangerous, too uncertain to confront, had been hiding in plain sight. And as investigators prepared to go deeper into the mine, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever had happened to Ethan, Lucas, and Hannah hadn't ended quickly. It had waited, in the dark, for someone to finally look. The recovery took days, not because investigators hesitated, but because the mine refused to give up what it held easily. Every movement underground carried risk. Supports groaned under pressure. Dust hung in the air long after footsteps stopped. Teams worked in shifts, documenting everything before it was touched, understanding that once the site was disturbed, it could never be fully reconstructed again. The 3 sets of remains were found deeper than anyone expected, beyond the initial collapse zone. They were close together, closer than chance would allow. Not scattered, not separated by distance or time. They had gathered in the same place, drawn there by necessity. Forensic teams noted the position first. 2 of the bodies were angled inward, as if shielding the third. It was impossible to know who had moved last, or whether the positioning was intentional or the result of collapse and gravity. But the proximity told a story of confinement, of limited space, of choices made under pressure. Personal items were cataloged carefully. A crushed flashlight, its casing split from impact. A bent metal water bottle, empty. Pieces of fabric caught on rock edges. A backpack strap torn clean through. Everything was consistent with sudden force, not prolonged violence. No weapon marks, no bindings, no signs of an outside presence. The mine itself provided the context investigators needed. The shaft the teens had entered wasn't meant for foot traffic. It had been a ventilation passage, narrow and unstable, even when it was active decades earlier. Over time, water infiltration had weakened supports. Minor collapses had occurred long before 2002, unnoticed and undocumented. Evidence suggested the teens had entered voluntarily. Footwear impressions, though degraded, indicated controlled movement at first. There were no signs of a fall at the entrance, no indication they had been forced or chased. They likely discovered the opening by accident, curiosity overcoming caution, the way it often does at 16 and 17. What happened next unfolded slowly, but the initial moment was violent. Blunt force trauma was evident on all 3 sets of remains, injuries consistent with falling debris and structural failure. Rocks, timbers, and earth would have come down without warning. The collapse sealed the shaft behind them, cutting off light, airflow, and escape in seconds. In many cases like this, that would have been the end of the story. A sudden accident, a brief explanation, tragedy without complication. But one detail refused to fit that version. On the wall of the tunnel, a short distance from where the remains were found, investigators noticed markings carved into the rock. They weren't deep. They weren't precise. They were rough, uneven lines made with something hard and sharp enough to scratch stone. Counting them took only a moment. 7 marks. They were spaced irregularly, some deeper than others. Not decorative, not random. Tally marks. The implication was immediate and devastating. At least one of the teens had survived the initial collapse. Medical examination supported it. One set of remains showed defensive fractures, injuries to the forearms and hands consistent with shielding against falling debris or repeated impacts. Those injuries were not fatal on their own. They suggested movement after the collapse, attempts to navigate the confined space, to clear debris, to protect others. The mine had not become a tomb instantly. It had become a trap. Air quality readings helped reconstruct the timeline. Ventilation had been compromised, but not eliminated. Oxygen levels would have dropped slowly, unevenly. Survivability depended on position, exertion, and time. Investigators estimated that at least one of the teens could have remained conscious for several days. Days in complete darkness. The tally marks suggested awareness of time passing, even without light, a count of days, or attempts at one. The uneven spacing hinted at exhaustion, fading strength, fading hope. Each mark represented effort, consciousness, the will to keep track when everything else was gone. There were no additional messages, no names carved, no pleas, just the marks. The remains were removed with care, placed into evidence containers that felt impossibly small given the weight they carried. When they reached the surface, the air felt different, even to seasoned investigators. It was hard not to imagine how long the teens had been deprived of it. Identification came through dental records and personal effects. The confirmations were methodical, clinical, necessary. Each one closed a door that had been left open for 6 years. The families were notified in person. There is no protocol for that moment that makes it easier. Words are chosen, then discarded. Explanations are offered carefully, aware that no amount of detail can soften the impact. The families received answers they had waited years for, answers they had begged for, answers that landed with a finality hope had never allowed. They learned their children had not run away. They learned there had been no stranger, no attack, no conspiracy. They learned that curiosity and bad luck, combined with forgotten infrastructure and delayed decisions, had been enough. Some found relief in knowing. Others felt the truth deepen the pain. Knowing there had been time. Knowing there had been darkness. Knowing someone had survived long enough to mark the wall. Grief shifted shape again. Public response was muted, but intense. Questions were asked about records, about oversight, about why the mine had never been fully investigated. Reviews were conducted. Policies were revised. Liability was acknowledged without assigning blame to individuals who had long since moved on. The mine was permanently sealed. This time, thoroughly. Entrances filled, shafts reinforced, warning markers installed, maps updated. The work was documented, photographed, signed off on. Nothing was left ambiguous. The ridge reopened to the public months later. Hikers returned. Hunters passed through. The forest absorbed the disruption and continued on. To most visitors, it was just another stretch of Tennessee woodland, quiet and unremarkable. But for those who knew the story, the ground felt different. There was no memorial placed near the site. The families chose privacy over permanence. The memory of Ethan Parker, Lucas Reed, and Hannah Collins lived in photographs, in shared stories, in the space they left behind. The case was closed officially, its mystery resolved not with a dramatic twist, but with the weight of reality. A hidden danger, a delayed discovery. Time doing what? It always does when answers are postponed. The forest remains quiet now. The mine stays sealed. And beneath the ridge, beneath layers of earth and stone, The place where 3 teenagers waited in the dark no longer exists as it once did. But the marks on the wall are documented forever. Proof that even in complete isolation, even with no certainty of rescue, someone kept track of time. And that, more than anything else found underground, is what still haunts the people who were finally brave enough to look.